Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail on a culinary longship, but we're not raiding monasteries or plundering gold. Instead, we're embarking on a journey into the heart of a Viking household. To uncover a forgotten art that was as fundamental to their survival as their axes and their bravery, the art of Viking bread baking. And let me tell you, this wasn't your quick 30-minute sourdough starter. No, this was an all-day, full-body commitment, a true testament to the sheer effort required to put food on the table in the Norse world. You might think your biggest kitchen challenge is kneading dough by hand for 10 minutes, but prepare yourselves, because the sheer scale of the labor involved in making a single loaf of Viking bread will make you appreciate every slice of modern, pre-sliced Wonder Bread you've ever eaten. You probably won't survive this deep dive into ancient grains without a newfound respect for historical homesteaders. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see how far these bedtime history trips reach, connecting us across time and space. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Into the forgotten, arduous, yet ultimately rewarding world of Viking bread. Our story begins not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet, fundamental need for sustenance. For the Vikings, bread wasn't just a side dish. It was the daily bread, the literal staff of life. It formed the caloric backbone of their diet, providing the energy needed for everything from farming and craftsmanship to those famous long voyages and fierce raids. Imagine waking up in a longhouse, the morning chills still biting, knowing that the most essential meal of your day, possibly the only substantial meal, required an entire day's worth of effort just to prepare. This daily ritual was far removed from our modern convenience culture. It was a constant physical reminder of humanity's direct reliance on the land and sheer muscle power. This emphasis on grain, as a primary food source for agricultural societies, is a mainstream historical fact. It's fundamental to their survival. The grains themselves were hardy and resilient, suited to the often harsh Norse climate. We're talking about varieties of rye, barley, and oats, sometimes a bit of wheat, if it could be grown or traded for. These weren't the refined, high-yield grains of today. They were tough, often small and covered in protective husks that clung stubbornly to the kernels. This meant that extracting the edible grain was already a labor-intensive process, involving threshing and winnowing to separate the grain from the chaff. You couldn't just pop down to the local supermarket for a bag of organic ancient grain blend. Every single kernel had to be earned, sometimes through back-breaking work in the fields under the unpredictable Norse sky, then more work simply. To prepare it for milling, the motivation for this arduous work was simple: survival. Without bread, without this dense, energy-rich staple, the Vikings simply couldn't sustain their demanding way of life. Their children wouldn't grow, their farmers couldn't toil, and their warriors couldn't row their longships across vast, icy seas. Bread was the fuel for their sagas, the silent partner in every grand adventure. Its production was a core household activity, often overseen by the women of the longhouse, who held significant authority and responsibility in managing the domestic economy. This highlights a subtle but important historical detail often overlooked while men were away raiding. The survival of the community largely rested on the labor and ingenuity of the women. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some archaeological finds suggest that in addition to the common grains, Vikings might have occasionally used wild cereals or even collected seeds from various grasses when other harvests failed, incorporating them into their bread. Imagine the taste of a loaf made from, well, whatever they could scrounge up after a bad growing season. It's probably less artisanal and more, I'm just happy to have something to chew. Historians still debate the exact ratios and types of grains used in different regions and periods, as local availability and climate would have dictated the primary staples. What's clear is that they were highly adaptable in their use of whatever resources they had at hand. So, as the Viking dawn broke, the first thoughts of the longhouse inhabitants would turn to food, and specifically to the long grinding process that would eventually yield their daily bread. This wasn't a choice. It was a fundamental rhythm of life, dictated by the limitations of their technology and the relentless demands of their environment. The journey to a simple loaf of bread was, in itself, an epic saga of human endurance and ingenuity. Once the grains were harvested, threshed, and winnowed, a massive undertaking in itself, the real work of making bread, and particularly the stone grinding saga, truly began. This wasn't just a simple trip to the local mill. For most Viking households, flour production was a daily, currous, and all-day chore, often taking up a significant portion of a woman's waking hours. Forget your electric coffee grinders. Imagine grinding enough flour for a family for an entire day, by hand, with rudimentary tools. This process was far more physically demanding and time-consuming than you might ever imagine. The primary tool for this task was the cornstone. This consisted of two heavy circular stones, a stationary bottom stone, the meta, and a rotating top stone, the catalyst. The grains were poured into a hole in the center of the top stone, and then, using a wooden handle or peg, inserted into the top stone. It would be rotated repeatedly against the bottom stone. The friction and pressure between the two stones would grind the grain into flour, which would then spill out around the edges of the bottom stone. You can almost hear the rhythmic scraping, a constant, low-level hum that would have been a defining sound of any Viking longhouse. This is a mainstream historical fact. Cornstones were ubiquitous in ancient and medieval households across Europe. Imagine the effort involved. It required sustained, repetitive physical labor. You're kneeling or stooping over the stone constantly, turning that heavy top stone, feeling the resistance of the grains as they're crushed between the rough surfaces. Your arms ache, your back protests, and the dust from the milling slowly coats everything, including you. And you couldn't just stop when you were tired. The family needed bread. This wasn't a leisure activity. It was pure, unadulterated toil, day in and day out, rain or shine, through all seasons. A quirky tidbit, some cornstones particularly. Larger ones were often positioned slightly above floor level, sometimes on a low wooden stand, to make the grinding slightly less back-breaking. A small concession to ergonomics in an era of relentless labor. Historians still debate the exact output rate of these cornstones. While estimates vary, it's clear that producing enough flour for even a small family was a significant daily commitment, often requiring multiple family members to take turns. Quality of the flour was also highly dependent on the skill and perseverance of the grinder. Achieving a fine, consistent flour was incredibly difficult with cornstones. Most Viking bread would have been made from a coarse whole grain flour, often with remnants of bran and even small grit from the stone itself. This meant the bread would be very dense, rustic, and incredibly nutritious, but also sometimes literally gritty. It was a far cry from the finely sifted, bleached flours we use today. This inherent coarseness also meant the bread often had a shorter shelf life and a very different texture compared to modern loaves. The all-day nature of this task meant that flour production wasn't a separate, isolated job. It was interwoven. With other household activities, a woman might grind for an hour, then attend to children or other chores, then return to the cornstone. It was a constant cycle of intermittent but demanding physical effort, fitting into the flow of longhouse life. The rhythmic motion could also become meditative in its own way, a trance-like state born of necessity. Perhaps in the monotony, minds wandered, stories were told, or songs were sung to pass the endless hours. This relentless demand for flour underscores the communal nature of Viking life. Individual women were responsible for their households. Bread, the sound of grinding, would have been a constant backdrop in any larger settlement, a shared rhythm of daily existence. Ties them directly to their ancestors who also relied on such tools, highlighting the continuity of their basic needs across millennia. So, when you think of a Viking warrior, remember that behind every great feat of strength and endurance, there was likely a tireless woman, or perhaps several, who spent all day grinding the grains to fuel them. The success of a raid, the endurance of a long voyage, perhaps even the courage in battle, were all, in a very real sense, baked into the bread they ate. It was the ultimate slow food, born of necessity and monumental effort. With the coarse, hard-earned flour finally produced, the Viking baker's journey was far from over. Unlike modern bread that relies on commercial yeast packets, Viking bread often utilized a sourdough's secret keeper, a living starter. Ancient leavening agent was perhaps the most crucial element, carrying not just the wild yeasts from the air, but also generations of baking wisdom and literally the taste of home. This starter was a precious commodity, nurtured and maintained with care, for without it, their bread would be flat, dense, and far less digestible. Imagine a ceramic pot or a wooden container kept in a warm, sheltered spot near the hearth, perhaps covered with a linen cloth. Inside, a thick, bubbly mixture, smelling faintly of sour fruit and fermented grain. This was the sourdough starter, a symbiotic colony of wild yeasts and lactobacilli bacteria. Patiently cultivated from a simple mixture of flour and water left exposed to the ambient environment. This wasn't some scientific lab experiment. It was intuitive microbiology, born of centuries of trial and error. The successful maintenance of a healthy starter was a testament to the baker's skill and knowledge, as a dead starter meant no leavened bread, a real crisis in a world reliant on this staple. This reliance on natural sourdough for leavening is a mainstream historical fact common across many ancient cultures. The starter needed constant care and feeding. Every day, or every few days, a portion of the old starter would be used for baking, and then the remainder would be fed with fresh flour and water. This continuous cycle kept the yeast and bacteria active and vigorous. It was a bit like having a demanding, bubbly pet that required regular attention. If it wasn't fed properly, it would weaken. If it got too cold, it would become dormant. Too hot, and it might die. The rhythm of its feeding became part of the rhythm of daily life, another subtle connection to the natural world and its cycles. A quirky tidbit: some Viking households might have named their sourdough starters, attributing a personality or even a spiritual essence to this living ingredient, passing down the spirit of the bread through generations. Imagine a Viking grandmother proudly announcing, "Today, Harold, our starter, is feeling particularly bubbly." Historians still debate the exact methods of initiation and maintenance of these ancient starters, as detailed written recipes are scarce. But archaeological evidence and comparative ethnography provide insights. The active starter was what gave Viking bread its characteristic tangy flavor, dense texture, and improved digestibility. The wild yeasts would produce carbon dioxide, creating air pockets within the dough and giving the bread its rise. The lactobacilli would produce lactic and acetic acids, contributing to the sour flavor and also helping to preserve the bread. This natural fermentation process also helped break down some of the more complex carbohydrates in the coarse whole grains, making them easier to digest and allowing for better nutrient absorption. It was a sophisticated natural process, harnessed without any modern scientific understanding. This reliance on a living starter meant that the baking process was less predictable than modern methods. The rise time of the dough depended entirely on the vigor of the starter, the ambient temperature in the longhouse, and even the humidity in the air. A cold, damp day meant a very slow rise, potentially extending the all-day baking process even further. The baker had to be attuned to these environmental cues, exercising patience and intuition rather than following a precise timer. This required a deep connection to their surroundings, a kind of intuitive understanding of natural processes that we've largely lost in our industrialized food systems. So the sourdough starter wasn't just an ingredient, it was a living link to the past, a continuous line of fermentation, stretching back perhaps centuries within a family or community. It represented resilience, adaptation, and the ingenuity of people living in harmony with nature's subtle forces. As the baker took a portion of the bubbly starter to mix with the freshly ground flour, she was not just beginning to make bread, she was continuing a timeless tradition, keeping the secret keeper alive for another day, another generation, another loaf, to fuel the Viking way of life. With the lively sourdough starter, bubbly and active, and the coarse, freshly ground flour at hand, the Viking baker now faced another monumental task, kneading's mighty task. This was not a gentle, leisurely process. It was a full-body workout, physical and rhythmic engagement, with the dough that demanded strength, endurance, and a deep understanding of the raw ingredients. Forget your stand mixers. This was all about muscle and sweat, and it was absolutely crucial for developing the gluten structure that would give the dense Viking bread some semblance of chewiness and texture. The freshly ground flour, the active sourdough starter, a pinch of salt if available and not too precious, and water would be combined in a large wooden trough or a deep ceramic bowl. At first, it would be a shaggy, uncooperative mass, sticking to everything. But the baker, usually a woman with strong arms and a practiced rhythm, would begin the kneading. You can visualize her leaning over the trough, pushing, pulling, stretching, and folding the dough with powerful, repetitive motions. Her forearms would bulge with effort, her breathing would deepen, and a fine sheen of sweat would soon appear on her brow. This wasn't baking. This vigorous kneading is a mainstream historical fact, essential for activating the gluten in whole grain flours, especially without the benefit of refined flours. The duration of the kneading was significant. For a dense, coarse whole grain dough, especially with minimal gluten development from the type of grains available, this process could take a very long time, perhaps 30 minutes, to an hour or more for a substantial batch of bread for a large family or longhouse. It wasn't just about mixing ingredients, it was about transforming them, physically breaking down the flour particles and coaxing the gluten strands to align. This physical transformation was critical. If the dough wasn't kneaded enough, the bread would be too dense, crumbly, and heavy. It was kneaded to perfection, it would have a slight elasticity, allowing the gas from the sourdough to create a more open crumb. A quirky tidbit: some ancient bakers, including possibly Vikings, might have used their feet to knead very large batches of dough, stomping rhythmically in a clean trough, a truly full-body approach to bread making. Imagine the leg workout. Historians still debate the precise techniques used for large-scale kneading in Viking longhouses, but communal effort would have been common. The tactile feedback was crucial. A skilled baker would know, purely by feel, when the dough was sufficiently kneaded. It would become smoother, more elastic, less sticky, and develop a subtle give under her hands. There were no timers or digital scales. Only the ancient wisdom passed down through generations, learned through countless hours of practical experience. This intuitive understanding of the dough's texture and consistency was paramount, allowing them to adapt to variations in flour quality, starter vigor, and ambient temperature. This strenuous activity would often be a communal one in larger longhouses. Perhaps several women would take turns, each contributing their strength to the collective task. The rhythm of the kneading might have become a shared heartbeat of the domestic space, a constant, low thudding sound accompanying conversations, songs, or the stories told to children. It transformed a solitary chore into a shared endeavor, strengthening bonds as much as it strengthened dough. It highlights the often unseen physical labor that underpinned the Viking world, reminding us that their legendary strength wasn't just built on raiding, but on the daily, demanding work of survival. So, as the morning sun climbed higher, casting slanting rays into the longhouse, the kneading would continue. The baker, her muscles burning, her mind focused on the rhythmic motion, was not just preparing food. She was performing an act of physical and culinary alchemy, transforming simple, raw ingredients into the very foundation of her family's strength and sustenance. The mighty task of kneading was a vital step in the all-day process, ensuring that the Viking bread was not just edible, but robust, hearty, and capable of fueling the lives of a people who lived on the edge of the known world. It was a workout, a meditation, and a promise, all rolled into one, with the flour ground and the dough vigorously kneaded. The Viking baker's work shifted from brute strength to careful nurturing, entering the phase of the fermentation watch. This was the quiet, often agonizingly slow part of the process, where patience was the paramount virtue. Unlike modern breads that can proof in an hour or two with commercial yeast, Viking sourdough bread, relying on wild yeasts and variable temperatures, demanded constant vigilance and an intuitive understanding of its subtle rhythms. The kneaded dough typically formed into a large, rustic ball, would be placed in a wooden bowl or trough, often covered with a damp linen cloth to prevent it from drying out. Its placement was critical, in a warm, sheltered spot near the central hearth of the longhouse. You can imagine the baker checking on it periodically, not with a timer, but with a trained eye and touch, subtly feeling its texture, observing its slow, almost imperceptible growth. This slow process of fermentation is a mainstream historical fact, intrinsic to all traditional sourdough baking. The challenge lay in the climate control, or rather, the lack thereof. Viking longhouses were heated by a central hearth, but temperatures could fluctuate wildly depending on the time of day, the amount of fuel, and the weather outside. A cold snap could halt fermentation, as too much heat could overproof the dough, or even kill the delicate yeast culture. The baker had to be acutely aware of these environmental cues, perhaps moving the dough closer to the fire when cold, or further away when it felt too warm. It was a constant dance with nature, a testament to their intuitive understanding of thermodynamics without ever having studied it. This intuitive environmental control highlights the deep connection between daily tasks and the natural world. The phrase watching paint dry might seem tedious, but watching dough rise in a Viking longhouse could take hours, sometimes an entire afternoon. This period of waiting demanded immense patience. There was no instant gratification. The baker had to trust the living starter, trust the process, and trust her own judgment. She might use various subtle cues: the dough's initial slight expansion, the appearance of tiny bubbles on the surface, a subtle change in aroma from raw dough to a faint, tangy sourness. A quirky tidbit: some ancient bakers believed that leaving the dough near an open window or door for a brief period allowed it to catch more beneficial wild yeasts from the air, almost like a ritual of inviting the spirit of the bread into their home. Historians still debate the precise ritualistic aspects of dough rising beyond practical considerations. This long fermentation wasn't just about rising. It also developed the bread's complex flavor and improved its digestibility. The slow work of the yeasts and bacteria transformed the simple starches into a richer array of compounds, contributing to the tangy depth of true sourdough. It also began to break down some of the harder-to-digest components of the coarse whole, grains making the final bread more nutritious and easier on the stomach. It was a silent, slow alchemy, happening right there in the longhouse. This stage of the baking process truly cemented the all-day nature of Viking bread. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You simply had to wait, watch, and trust. This patience, cultivated daily in the domestic sphere, would have undoubtedly influenced other aspects of Viking life, teaching resilience and the understanding that good things take time, as the dough slowly swelled in its wooden bowl. Under the watchful eye of the baker, it was not just a simple loaf taking shape. It was a symbol of enduring patience, deep intuition, and the quiet, continuous rhythm of a life lived in profound harmony with the natural world. After the arduous kneading and the patient fermentation watch, the moment finally arrived to bring the dough to the heat. But for Viking bakers, this wasn't about sliding a perfectly proofed loaf into a gleaming modern oven with precise temperature settings. It was about utilizing the ash and hearth's embrace, tapping into the raw power of fire and stone, and adapting to the diverse, often improvised, baking environments available in their world. This stage was as much an art of improvisation and observation as the earlier steps were of strength and patience. The most common and accessible oven was the longhouse hearth itself. A central open fire was the heart of any Viking dwelling, providing warmth, light, and a place for cooking. To bake bread here, the method was remarkably simple. The hot embers and ash from the fire would be raked aside, creating a clear, flat, intensely hot surface on the stone or packed earth hearth. The shaped dough, often a flatbread or a rustic round loaf, would then be placed directly onto this hot surface. The embers would then be raked back over the top of the dough, creating an all-around baking environment. You can imagine the smell of sizzling dough, the crackle of embers, and the subtle dance of smoke. This direct method of baking on hot stones, or under ash is a mainstream historical fact, common in many ancient cultures, beyond the open hearth. Vikings also employed other forms of primitive ovens, depending on the region and the specific longhouse setup. Some might have had small, domed clay or stone ovens built into the walls of the longhouse or just outside. These ovens would be heated by building a fire inside them, allowing the heat to absorb into the thick clay or stone walls. The embers would be raked out, and the bread would be placed directly onto the hot oven floor. A leather flap or stone slab would then seal the opening, trapping the heat inside to bake the bread. This offered a more consistent and even baking environment than the open hearth, but still relied on intuition for temperature control. A quirky tidbit: some archaeological evidence suggests that special clay baking bells or cloches might have been placed directly over dough on a flat hearth, with embers then piled on top of the bell, creating a miniature portable oven effect for a single loaf. This would have provided a much better crust and consistent heat. Historians still debate the prevalence and exact design of these various baking apparatuses across different Viking settlements. The type of bread they baked was heavily influenced by these methods. Flatbreads were quick to cook and could be easily cooked on hot stones or iron griddles over an open flame, making them a common staple. These would be thin, dense, and ideal for a quick meal. The denser, leavened sourdough loaves would require the sustained heat of being buried in ash or baked in a domed oven to cook through properly, without burning. These larger loaves would develop a thick, dark, chewy crust from the direct contact with the hot surfaces, texture far removed from our soft, airy modern breads. The timing and temperature control were purely by intuition. There were no thermometers. The baker judged the heat of the hearth by how quickly the embers glowed, how far she could hold her hand above the surface, or by the scent of the heated stone. She knew when to remove the embers, when to place the bread, and when to turn it, or remove it, all through centuries of passed-down wisdom and countless hours of practical experience. This intuitive mastery, often passed from mother to daughter, was paramount. Slight misjudgment could result in a burnt, inedible crust, or a raw, doughy interior. So, as the afternoon wore on, with the dough finally risen, the longhouse would fill with a new aroma, the enticing smell of baking bread, a sign that the day's long efforts were finally culminating. The baker, perhaps tired but with a sense of purpose, carefully managed the fire, the ash, and the precious loaves, transforming humble flour into the very sustenance of her family and community. The ashen hearth, primitive yet powerful, were the final embrace for the Viking bread, turning the fruits of all-day labor into a dark, crusty, and essential reality. As the tantalizing aroma of baking bread filled the longhouse, the Viking baker embarked on the final, crucial stage of the process, baking by intuition, with no timers, no thermometers, and no precise recipes written down. This was an art passed through generations, relying entirely on sensory input, accumulated wisdom, and an almost mystical connection to the fire and the dough. It was a high-stakes guessing game, where the reward was sustenance, and the penalty was a burnt or undercooked loaf. The heat of the hearth or the domed oven was everything, and judging it accurately was paramount. A skilled Viking baker would know, often instinctively, whether the fire had been hot enough for long enough, how deep to bury the loaf in the ashes, or when the ideal residual heat in a stone oven had been reached. She might use her hand to feel the intensity, or simply observe the color and behavior of the embers. The subtle crackle of the cooking crust, the specific scent of the browning grain, the feel of the loaf when gently tapped tall, were clues in this ancient culinary detective work. This intuitive judgment is a mainstream historical fact. It's common in all pre-industrial baking traditions. The coarse, dense nature of Viking bread meant it required a longer, slower bake than modern airy loaves. It needed to cook through to the center without burning the exterior. It's often involved turning the loaf, adjusting its position in the ashes, or even briefly removing it from the oven to cool slightly before returning it to the heat. It was a constant dance of adjustment and observation, a dialogue between the baker and the bread. Quirky tidbit: some Viking bakers might have used a simple wooden skewer or a thin piece of bone to test the doneness of the loaf, exerting it into the center. If it came out clean, the bread was done. This early form of a cake tester would have been an invaluable tool in ensuring a thoroughly cooked interior. Historians still debate the specific methods of doneness testing, as many ancient practices were undocumented beyond oral tradition. The stakes were high. A burnt loaf was wasted grain, wasted labor, and a hungry family. An undercooked loaf was hard to digest and could lead to illness. Every loaf mattered. This constant pressure honed the baker's skills to an exceptional degree. There was no room for error or distraction. Her intuition was born of necessity, refined by countless successes and failures. This practical knowledge was invaluable. Form of intellectual property more precious than gold in a society dependent on its basic food supply. This intuitive baking also reinforced the deep connection between the Vikings and their environment. The temperamental nature of fire, the variability of wood fuel, the influence of ambient temperature, all these natural factors directly impacted the success of the bake. The baker was not controlling nature, but working in harmony with it, adapting her methods to its shifting moods. It was a constant lesson in humility and responsiveness. As the sun began its descent, the long process of baking would culminate in the golden, or often dark brown, almost black glory of a freshly baked loaf. The satisfying aroma, the crisp crackle of the crust, the steam rising as it was pulled from the heat, these were the rewards for a day of relentless effort. The bread, hot and earthy, was a triumph, a symbol of perseverance, resourcefulness, and the profound art of baking by intuition. It was a sensory experience far richer than any modern pre-packaged food. A direct link to the fire, the earth, and the hands that worked it. This isn't just about food, it's about life itself, shaped by the rhythm of the hearth and the wisdom of instinct. With the long, arduous process of baking complete, the result was a loaf of bread that was far more than just food. It was the flavor of survival, embodying the earthy taste and vital nutritional value derived from ancient grains and a full day's labor. This wasn't a delicate pastry. It was dense, dark, and packed with the sustenance necessary to fuel a hard-working Viking life. The taste of Viking bread would have been intensely earthy and tangy, largely due to the use of whole grains like rye and barley, and the characteristic sourness of the sourdough fermentation. Rye, in particular, imparts a robust, slightly bitter, and distinctly sour flavor, which would have been amplified by the long, slow sourdough process. Barley, a common grain in the Norse lands, would have added a hearty, almost nutty undertone. This robust flavor profile is a mainstream historical fact. It's distinct from the lighter, sweeter breads common in many parts of the world today. Forget subtle notes. This bread would have smacked you with flavor beyond taste. The nutritional value was immense. These whole grains, coarsely ground, retained all their bran and germ, meaning they were rich in fiber, vitamins, especially B, vitamins and minerals like iron and magnesium that are often stripped away in modern refined flours. The sourdough fermentation process also played a crucial role here. It's making these nutrients more bioavailable and breaking down phytic acid, which can inhibit nutrient absorption. This meant that every dense bite provided a substantial and efficient energy source, crucial for a people engaged in physically demanding activities. It was literally their energy bar, but a lot bigger and grimier. The texture would have been equally distinct. Imagine a bread that was dense, heavy, and often quite coarse. It wouldn't have been light and airy like a modern baguette. The crust would be thick, dark, and chewy, likely from direct contact with hot ash or stone. The crumb or interior would be compact, perhaps slightly moist, and almost certainly gritty in places from remnants of bran and cornstone fragments. This texture was a sign of its authenticity and its robust nature, designed to keep hunger at bay for hours. A quirky tidbit. Some archaeological evidence suggests that Viking bread might have occasionally included crushed animal bone or ground bark during times of severe scarcity, further emphasizing its role as a survival food, and it's incredibly diverse. If an appetizing, ingredient-less during lean years, historians still debate the extent of these extreme additions. This bread was the very definition of a staple. It would be eaten with almost every meal, accompanying dried fish, preserved meats, cheese, and vegetables. It would be used as a base for stews, dipped into broth, or simply eaten plain. Its density and long-lasting nature meant it was also ideal for storage, especially on long voyages. A well-baked, hearty loaf could sustain a warrior or a fisherman for days, providing consistent energy in challenging environments. It was the original food to go. Perfect for a raiding party or a lengthy trading expedition, the satisfaction derived from eating this bread would have been profound. It wasn't just about filling one's stomach. It was about consuming the fruits of immense labor, the very essence of survival. Every bite would be a reminder of the hard work of planting, harvesting, grinding, kneading, and baking. It connected the eater directly to the earth, the sun, and the hands that prepared it. This simple loaf represented the ingenuity and resilience of an entire culture, a powerful symbol of their ability to thrive in a demanding world. So, when you bite into your next sandwich, take a moment to imagine the sheer effort behind a Viking's daily bread. It puts whole wheat in a whole new perspective, beyond its fundamental role as sustenance. The act of baking bread in Viking society was deeply interwoven with the social fabric of the community. It was an activity that cemented bonds shared, labor, and served as a powerful symbol of domesticity and provision. It was bread as community, an essential element that brought families and longhouses together in a unique and tangible way. In the communal living of a longhouse, where multiple generations or even several families might reside under one roof. Bread baking was often a shared endeavor, while typically overseen by the women. The sheer physical demands of grinding the grain, kneading the dough, and tending the fire meant that contributions from various family members were common. Younger women would learn by watching and assisting their mothers and grandmothers, perpetuating the centuries-old techniques through observation and direct participation. Children might help by sorting grains or fetching water. This communal labor fostered a sense of collective responsibility and shared purpose, strengthening family ties in a very practical way. This informal apprenticeship and knowledge transfer is a mainstream historical fact in pre-industrial societies. The rhythm of the baking process itself would have dictated the rhythm of daily life within the longhouse. The low, rhythmic scraping of the cornstone, the thudding of kneading dough, the quiet bubbling of the sourdough starter, and finally, the enticing aroma of baking bread. These were the daily sounds and smells that defined the domestic space. They were constants, reassuring signals that the household was functioning, that food was being prepared, and that the cycle of life continued. It was a sensory backdrop to family conversations, storytelling, and the various crafts undertaken. Within the longhouse walls, the sharing of the freshly baked loaf was a central moment. Imagine a large, dark, crusty loaf, pulled hot from the hearth, broken or sliced and distributed among the family. This was more than just a meal. It was an act of communal sustenance, a physical manifestation of the longhouse providing for its members. Breaking bread together fostered a sense of unity and gratitude, reinforcing social cohesion in a way that modern, individually packaged foods simply cannot. A quirky tidbit: some folk traditions suggest that the first slice of a freshly baked loaf might be offered to the hearth fire, or a protective household spirit, a small gesture of gratitude and reverence for the elements and unseen forces that aided the baking process. This highlights the blend of practical survival and animistic beliefs in Viking life. Historians still debate the prevalence of specific household rituals associated with bread. Moreover, bread could also be a medium for hospitality and social exchange. Offering a fresh loaf to a guest or a traveler was a profound gesture of welcome and generosity. It represented a significant investment of time and labor, and thus conveyed great respect. Similarly, exchanging loaves or flour between longhouses or neighboring families could strengthen bonds, ensuring mutual support and resilience in times of scarcity. It was a tangible form of social currency, demonstrating goodwill and interdependence. This shared economy of basic necessities was vital for survival in scattered settlements. even beyond the longhouse. The bread's significance extended. Viking man leaving on a long journey, whether for trade, exploration, or raiding, would carry dense, hard bread as a vital part of his provisions. This bread, often baked by the women of his household, represented the ties to home, a tangible link to his family and community, even when he was far across the sea. It was a powerful psychological comfort, a taste of home in distant foreign lands. The success of his endeavors literally depended on the sustenance provided by his kin. So, the forgotten art of Viking bread baking wasn't just a technical process. It was a deeply human one, embedding itself into the very core of Viking community and identity. It brought people together, taught patience and shared labor, and provided the fundamental sustenance that fueled an entire civilization. The daily bread was a powerful symbol of their resilience, their ingenuity, and their profound connection to each other and to the land they worked so hard to cultivate. The demanding all-day process of Viking bread baking, while essential to their survival, relied on techniques that were gradually lost techniques, modern echoes. Over centuries, as societies changed, technology advanced, and trade routes expanded, many of these arduous, time-consuming methods faded from common practice. Yet, the principles and even some of the tastes of Viking bread continue to resonate. Finding echoes in modern, artisanal movements and historical reconstructions, the most significant factor in the decline of traditional Viking baking methods was the introduction of watermills and windmills. From the late Viking Age and into the medieval period, these innovations mechanized the most labor-intensive step, grinding flour. Instead of hours of hand grinding with cornstones, large quantities of grain could be processed relatively quickly and efficiently, moving flour production from the individual household to centralized mills. This industrial revolution, albeit on a pre-industrial scale, fundamentally changed the domestic economy and freed up immense amounts of time for Viking, and later, medieval women. This shift from manual to mechanical milling is a mainstream historical fact, occurring across Europe. Further changes came with the development of more advanced oven technologies. As permanent settlements grew and masonry techniques improved, communal bake ovens became more common. These large shared ovens, heated by dedicated fires, could reach and retain higher, more consistent temperatures, allowing for more diverse and less intuitively baked breads. The need for burying loaves in ash or relying solely on hearth heat diminished. The introduction of commercial yeasts in later centuries further simplified the leavening process, making consistent bread rising far more predictable and less dependent on the fickle nature of wild sourdough starters. The emphasis also shifted from dense, whole grain sourdough bread to lighter, often more refined loaves, particularly as wheat became more widely available and desirable for its higher gluten content and lighter texture. The gritty texture and intense sourness of traditional Viking bread might have been seen as less desirable as tastes evolved and more refined options became possible. The daily grind for survival slowly morphed into a quest for culinary refinement, changing not just the methods but the very nature of bread itself. However, these lost techniques haven't entirely vanished. In the modern era, there's been a growing revival of ancient baking methods, particularly the resurgence of sourdough baking and the interest in ancient grains. Artisanal bakers today meticulously cultivate their sourdough starters, experiment with heritage grains like rye and spelt, sometimes even use wood-fired ovens that mimic some of the heat characteristics of ancient hearths. This is driven by a desire for unique flavors, healthier options, and a connection to culinary history. A quirky tidbit: some modern reenactor communities and historical living enthusiasts spend days meticulously grinding their own flour with replica cornstones, just to fully experience the immense labor that went into a single loaf of Viking bread. A true appreciation for the forgotten art. Historians still debate whether modern sourdough truly captures the exact taste and texture of Viking bread, given differences in ancient grain varieties and ambient yeast strains, archaeological discoveries of preserved grains, cornstones, and oven remnants continue to shed light on these forgotten practices, providing tangible links to the Viking past. Researchers meticulously analyze these findings to understand not just the ingredients, but the entire process, piece by piece, helping to reconstruct a culinary heritage that was once common, but is now a specialized art form. So, while the Viking woman no longer toils all day at the cornstone or intuitively manages a bread buried in ash, the echoes of her labor persist. The long, slow process of Viking bread baking, born of necessity and ingenious adaptation, serves as a powerful reminder of how our food systems have evolved, and how the conveniences of today often obscure the immense human effort that once sustained civilizations. The art may have been forgotten, but its spirit continues to inspire those who seek a deeper connection to their food. While bread was undeniably the cornerstone of the Viking diet, their ingenuity with grains extended beyond the loaf. They were masters of resourcefulness, utilizing every part of their precious grain harvests in various forms, ensuring efficiency and diversifying their sustenance in a challenging environment. It wasn't just about making bread. It was about squeezing every last drop of value from their cereal crops. One of the most significant, beyond the loaf uses for grains, was in the production of ale and beer. For the Vikings, ale wasn't just a recreational drink. It was a fundamental part of their diet, providing calories, hydration safer than water in many instances, and a source of fermentation byproducts beneficial for gut health. Barley was the primary grain for brewing, but oats and rye could also be used. The brewing process involved malting the grain, allowing it to sprout slightly, then drying it to convert starches into fermentable sugars, then mashing it with hot water, and finally fermenting it with wild yeasts. This often took place in large wooden vats in the longhouse, a process that would have been a continuous cycle. This production of ale as a staple beverage is a mainstream historical fact, central to daily life and feasting in Viking and other ancient Germanic cultures. Imagine the longhouse filling with the sweet, malty aroma of brewing ale, mixing with the earthy scent of baking bread. It was a sensory symphony of sustenance. The byproducts of brewing, like spent grain, would not be wasted. This mash, still rich in nutrients, could be fed to livestock, particularly pigs, or even incorporated into some forms of coarser flatbreads. For human consumption, demonstrating their incredible commitment to zero-waste resourcefulness, a quirky tidbit. Some historical sources suggest that Viking women, known as brewsters, were the primary brewers in the household, and that a good brewster was as valued as a skilled baker. Her ability to consistently produce nourishing ale being vital for family and community health. Historians still debate the exact recipes and brewing techniques. Its documentation is scarce and varies regionally. Grains also played a role in making porridges and gruels, particularly during colder months, or for quick, simple meals. Boiled oats or barley, perhaps mixed with water, milk if available, dried berries, or even bits of meat or fish, would form a thick, warming and highly nutritious gruel. This was especially important for children, the elderly, and the sick, providing easily digestible nourishment. It was versatile, adaptable, and could be prepared relatively quickly compared to bread. This basic form of cooked cereal was a fundamental part of the diet across many ancient societies. Furthermore, grain could be used to create crisp breads, or crackers often baked thinly and dried to preserve them for very long periods. These would be ideal for long voyages or as emergency rations, offering a stable food source that resisted spoilage. Unlike the dense, moist sourdough loaves, these would be almost entirely dry, making them excellent for provisions. The straw and stalks from the grain harvest also had uses beyond food. They would be used for thatching roofs, providing insulation for longhouses, or mixed with clay for wattle and daub construction. Leftover straw could also be used as bedding for humans and animals, or as animal fodder. This holistic approach. 2, their crops ensured that very little went to waste, maximizing every bit of energy and material derived from the land. It speaks to a deep connection with nature and a profound understanding of ecological cycles. It's driven by necessity. So while the image of Viking bread baking captures the immense effort of their primary staple, It's important to remember that their relationship with grains was far more expansive. From the daily sustenance of bread and ale to the simple nourishment of porridge and the practical uses of straw, grains were the versatile backbone of Viking life, providing not just food, but also shelter and comfort. Their ingenuity ensured that every single kernel and every associated byproduct contributed to their survival and prosperity. While literary sources and sagas provide glimpses into Viking life, the most concrete evidence of their daily bread-making practices comes from the silent testimony of the earth itself, archaeological crumbs. The painstaking work of archaeologists has unearthed a wealth of physical remnants, allowing us to piece together the story of Viking bread. From the grains they grew to the ovens they used, providing tangible links to this forgotten art. Most common and widespread archaeological finds are fragments of cornstones. These heavy, durable grinding stones often survive centuries of burial. Found in Viking longhouse sites across Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and other areas of Norse settlement. Archaeologists analyze the wear patterns on these stones, the types of grit embedded in them, and their size, to understand how they were used, the types of grains processed, and the scale of the milling. The sheer number of these finds underscores the universality of hand-grinding flour as a daily household chore. This prevalence of cornstone remains is a mainstream historical fact, confirming their central role. Beyond the grinding tools, archaeologists also look for evidence of the grains themselves, while fresh bread rarely survives. Carbonized grain kernels are occasionally preserved in archaeological contexts, especially in areas affected by fire or waterlogging. Analyzing these charred remains allows botanists to identify the specific species of rye, barley, oats, or wheat that Vikings cultivated and consumed. Sometimes even fragments of carbonized bread or porridge are found, providing direct proof of their dietary staples. These tiny burnt crumbs offer immense insights into ancient recipes and cooking methods. A quirky tidbit: in some extremely rare cases, bread or dough fragments have been found perfectly preserved in bog environments in northern Europe. It's often associated with ritualistic deposits, offering an almost untouched glimpse into their ancient texture and composition. Historians still debate the precise cultivation techniques and genetic variations of ancient Norse grains compared to modern varieties. Evidence of Viking ovens and hearths is also crucial. The central hearths of longhouses are consistently found, often with surrounding stone slabs or packed earth floors, showing signs of intense heat. Occasionally, the remains of more structured clay or stone ovens are unearthed, providing clues about their construction and capacity. The presence of ash layers containing specific carbonized plant remains can further confirm their use for baking or cooking grains. The careful mapping of these features within longhouse structures helps reconstruct the domestic activity space. Archaeological analysis of human remains can also provide indirect clues. Dental wear patterns in Viking skeletons often show significant attrition, sometimes attributed to the coarse, gritty nature of their bread, which likely contains small particles from the stone grinding process. Isotope analysis of bones can also shed light on dietary staples, confirming the prominence of grains in their diet. So, even the teeth of a Viking warrior tell a story about their bread. Furthermore, the discovery of specialized baking tools like iron griddles for flatbreads and remnants of wooden troughs or ceramic bowls used for kneading and fermenting contribute to the picture. While wood and organic materials rarely survive, their impressions in the soil or associated metal fittings can indicate their presence and function. These archaeological crumbs, these silent witnesses from the past, are vital for understanding the full story of Viking bread. They move beyond theory and provide tangible proof of the immense daily effort that went into producing this life-sustaining staple. They allow us to imagine the sounds, the smells, and the sheer physical demands of a Viking household, reminding us that even the most mundane aspects of ancient life required extraordinary ingenuity and perseverance. It's a detective story where every fragment of grain or piece of stone helps build a more complete picture of a forgotten art, the forgotten art of Viking bread baking. With its all-day demands and profound connection to nature, offers compelling lessons in patience. In our fast-paced, instant gratification world, the arduous process of producing a single loaf of ancient bread stands as a powerful reminder of how our relationship with food, time, and labor has fundamentally changed. This isn't just about history, it's about reevaluating what we value and how we live. The most obvious lesson is the sheer, unyielding demand for patience. From the slow growth of the grains in the field, through the hours of hand-grinding flour, the unpredictable waiting for sourdough to ferment, the intuitive judgment of baking in an open hearth. Every step of Viking bread production was a masterclass in delayed gratification. There were no shortcuts, no quick fixes. The baker could not rush nature or force the process. This contrasts sharply with modern bread making, where a loaf can be mixed, risen, and baked in a few hours thanks to commercial yeast, refined flours, and precise ovens. The Vikings understood that good food took time, and that time demanded respect. This historical truth about pre-industrial food production is a mainstream fact, beyond patience. Viking bread teaches us about resourcefulness and resilience. They didn't have specialized equipment or a global supply chain. They worked with what they had: hardy grains, simple stones, and fire. They maximized every kernel, every husk, and every byproduct, ensuring nothing went to waste. This deep connection to their environment and their ability to adapt to its limitations is a stark contrast to our modern reliance on abundant, often imported resources. It's a reminder that ingenuity often blossoms most vibrantly under constraint. A quirky tidbit: some contemporary survivalists attempt to recreate Viking-era self-sufficiency, including hand-grinding flour and baking over open fires as a practical exercise in understanding fundamental human needs and resilience. Historians still debate the degree to which Viking survival was due to inherent resilience versus their effective adaptation of available resources. The process also highlights the inherent value of labor. For the Vikings, food wasn't just bought, it was earned. The tangible effort of grinding, kneading, and baking instilled a profound appreciation for every bite. There was no casual waste, no uneaten crusts left behind. This direct link between effort and sustenance fostered a deep sense of gratitude and respect for food that is often lost in our modern, abstracted food systems. It reminds us that valuing food inherently means valuing the labor that goes into producing it. Viking bread also offers a lesson in connectedness to nature and community. The success of the bake depended on understanding the subtleties of weather, temperature, and the living organisms in their sourdough. It was often a communal effort, strengthening bonds within the longhouse and the wider settlement. This reminds us of a time when food production was deeply integrated into daily life and social structures, rather than being a distant, industrialized process. It prompts us to consider the social implications of our own food systems today. So, as we reflect on the arduous all-day process of Viking bread baking, it's more than just a historical account of a forgotten art. It's a profound lesson in patience, resilience, and the true value of sustenance. It encourages us to slow down, to appreciate the effort behind our food, perhaps even to reconsider our own relationship with time and the resources we consume. The humble loaf of Viking bread, though long gone, continues to offer a powerful silent lesson from the past. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows over the ancient lands of the Norse, we bring our culinary voyage to a gentle close. The story of the forgotten art of Viking bread baking is more than just a historical account. It's a profound testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the timeless rhythms of life connected to the land. Tonight, we embrace a dreaming of rye kind of good night, reflecting on the enduring legacy of this humble yet monumental staple. Think about the sheer scale of effort involved in that all-day loaf, from the tireless grinding of grains on the cornstone, turning rough kernels into coarse flour, to the meticulous nurturing of a bubbly sourdough starter, a living legacy passed down through generations. Remember the strenuous task of kneading, a full-body workout that shaped not just the dough, but the very strength and endurance of the Viking people. Consider the patient watch over the slow fermentation, a dance with ambient temperatures and wild yeasts, and the intuitive art of baking in the raw embrace of ash and hearth. Every bite of that dense, earthy bread was a mouthful of monumental labor, profound patience, and deep ancestral wisdom. It truly puts your modern, effortlessly acquired slice of bread into a whole new, astonishing perspective. The Viking loaf, often made primarily from rye, barley, or oats, wasn't just fuel for raids and voyages. It was the bedrock of their daily existence, sustaining families, fostering community, and connecting them intimately to their environment. Beyond the bread, their resourceful use of grains extended to brewing nourishing ale, making hearty porridges, crafting durable crisp breads, and even utilizing the straw for longhouse construction and animal bedding. Very little went to waste, a stark lesson in sustainability born of necessity. Archaeological crumbs. From worn cornstones to carbonized grain fragments and dental wear on Viking skeletons, silently confirm the immense physical demands and nutritional backbone this staple provided. These remnants allow us to reconstruct a forgotten art, bridging the gap between ancient necessity and modern fascination. Ultimately, the story of Viking bread is a timeless lesson in patience, resilience, and the true value of sustenance. It encourages us to slow down, to appreciate the effort behind our food, and to recognize the intricate web of community and nature that sustains us. In a world of instant gratification, the Viking baker, patiently grinding grain from dawn till dusk, reminds us that some of the greatest rewards come from the most profound and unhurried efforts. Their bread was a quiet epic, a daily triumph of perseverance over challenge. So, as you drift deeper into your own slumber, let the earthy aroma of freshly baked rye bread fill your dreams. Imagine the rhythmic sounds of the cornstone, the warmth of the hearth, and the satisfying crackle of a crusty loaf pulled from the ashes. Let the image of strong, enduring Vikings, nourished by the fruits of their hard-earned labor, guide you into a tranquil, restorative sleep. The wisdom of the past, baked into every ancient crumb, has been shared. Sleep well, knowing the profound effort that once went into every single bite and dream of rye. Good night.